A snowstorm raged on Christmas Eve. A woman clutched her small son, walking down a dark road, wind cutting their faces raw. The boy cried, "Mommy, are we going to die?" She knocked on door after door. No one answered. Headlights cut through the darkness. A truck stopped. A man stepped out, draping his coat over her shoulders. "You'll freeze to death out here." She trembled. "We have nowhere to go." He looked into her eyes, snow swirling in the headlights. He said quietly, "You do now." And no one knew. Fate had just begun reversing itself. Ethan Cole was 37 years old, a single dad working night shifts as a mechanic in Lucerne, Switzerland. He lived with his 9-year-old daughter Lily in a small house on the outskirts of town. After night shifts, he often drove through the mountain pass, the same road where he'd nearly died in a car accident 3 years ago. That night, in the middle of a blizzard, he spotted a woman and small child huddled by the roadside. Her name was Grace Miller, 29 years old, holding her 5-year-old son, Noah, lost after being evicted from their boarding house for unpaid rent. They'd walked for hours in the snow, knocking on doors. Every door had remained closed. Ethan pulled over without hesitation. "Get in," he said, opening the passenger door. "You can't stay out here." Grace was too cold to argue, too exhausted to be cautious. She climbed in with Noah, who was barely conscious from the cold. Ethan drove them to his house, made hot soup, turned up the heat, and gave them warm clothes from his closet. When Lily woke up and came downstairs, she found 2 strangers in their living room. "Dad, who are they?" she asked, confused but not afraid. Ethan knelt beside her. "People who need help, just like someone helped Dad once." Grace tried to thank him, but her voice was hoarse, her eyes filled with fear and shame. "We'll leave in the morning," she whispered. "I don't want to impose." "It's Christmas Eve," Ethan said firmly. "No one should be alone tonight." Real witness detail. At the dinner table, Lily split her small Christmas cookie in half, giving the larger piece to Noah. "If you don't have a home, then our home is your home." Noah looked at the cookie, then at Lily, tears streaming down his face. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. Grace started to cry, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of a child. Ethan watched them, remembering his own desperate moments 3 years ago, lying in a burning car, certain he would die. Someone had saved him that night, a stranger whose face he'd never seen clearly through the smoke and flames. He'd spent years trying to find her, to thank her, but she'd disappeared like a ghost. Maybe this was how he could repay that debt, by being that stranger for someone else. "You can stay as long as you need," he said quietly. "I mean it." Grace looked at him with disbelief. "Why would you do this for us? You don't know anything about us." "I don't need to know your story to know you need help," Ethan replied. "That's enough." That night, Grace and Noah slept in the attic guest room. It was the first warm bed they had had in 3 months. Grace lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Noah curled beside her, sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. She thought about the car accident 3 years ago, the night her entire life had changed. She'd been working as an ER nurse, driving home from a late shift, when she'd seen the wreckage. A truck engulfed in flames, a man trapped inside. She'd pulled over, run to the vehicle, pulled him free seconds before the fuel tank exploded. She'd saved his life, but lost her job for abandoning her post without permission. Her supervisor had been furious. Hospital policy was clear. Off-duty staff couldn't administer emergency aid without proper authorization. She'd been fired the next day. Her husband had left shortly after, unable to handle their financial struggles. And for 3 years, she'd spiraled downward, from apartment to cheaper apartment, from job to job until there was nothing left. Now here she was, in a stranger's home, being shown kindness she didn't deserve. She pulled a small piece of burned fabric from her pocket, a corner of a shirt she'd torn from the man she'd saved, kept all these years as a reminder that once she'd done something that mattered. She didn't know his name, didn't know if he'd survived long-term, but she'd kept the fabric anyway, as proof that she'd been someone who saved lives, not just someone who needed saving. The next morning, Ethan offered to drive them to the church shelter to find more permanent assistance. Grace refused to stay longer. "I can't impose on your kindness anymore. You've done enough," he said. "If someone once saved me, Then helping others is the only way I know to pay it back. She asked, who saved you? He shook his head, wouldn't say. The truth was too complicated, the memory too painful, the search too futile. So Grace and Noah stayed temporarily in the attic room. Lily and Noah became fast friends, drawing together, baking cookies, doing homework side by side. The house, which had been quiet for so long, filled with the sound of children's laughter. One evening, Grace found Ethan sitting in his workshop, staring at an old photograph, a burned-out truck, his own younger face barely recognizable through the soot and blood. "Was that your accident?" she asked softly. He nodded slowly. "3 years ago, someone pulled me out just before it exploded. A woman I never got to thank." Grace's hand trembled. The image of that night came rushing back with devastating clarity. She should tell him. She should say the words, "Cesars." That was me. But she couldn't. What if he felt obligated to help her because of it? What if his kindness was just guilt instead of genuine compassion? So she stayed silent, the burned fabric in her pocket feeling heavier than ever. Real witness detail. That night, Grace pulled out the piece of fabric and held it against one of Ethan's work shirts hanging in the laundry room. The pattern matched perfectly. Blue and gray plaid, distinctive weave. It was him. She'd been living in his house, eating his food, accepting his help, and the entire time they'd been connected by a moment 3 years ago that had destroyed her life and saved his. The irony was almost unbearable. Days passed. Grace helped around the house, cooking meals, cleaning, trying to earn her keep somehow. She applied for jobs at every store, restaurant, and clinic in town. But with gaps in her resume and no references, no one would hire her. "I'm a burden to you," she said to Ethan one evening. "I can feel it." "You're not," he insisted. "You're helping. Lily loves having Noah here. The house feels like a home again, instead of just a place to sleep. But we can't stay forever." "Why not?" Ethan asked simply. "Why do we put time limits on kindness? Why does help have to have an expiration date?" Grace had no answer to that. One afternoon, while Ethan was at work, a man knocked on the door. Mr. Hendricks, the boarding house owner who'd evicted them. "I know you're here," he sneered at Grace through the screen door. "You owe me 3 months' rent. Pay up or I'm calling the police right now." Grace's face went pale. "I don't have it. You know I don't have it." "Then you'll go to jail for theft. You stole housing by staying without paying." "I was working double shifts trying to save enough." "Not my problem." He pushed past her into the house, looking around with calculating eyes. "Nice place. Maybe your new boyfriend can pay your debts for you." "He's not my boyfriend. He's just helping us." "Sure he is." Hendricks grabbed her arm roughly. "You're coming with me right now to file charges." "Don't touch me!" Grace pulled away. That's when Lily appeared at the top of the stairs holding her father's phone. "Let her go," the 9-year-old said, her voice shaking but determined. "Or I'm calling 911 right now." Hendricks laughed. "You're going to call the cops on me? I'm the victim here, little girl." "You're hurting her," Lily said. "That's assault. My dad told me what assault means." She'd already dialed. Her finger hovered over the call button. Hendricks released Grace and stepped back, his face twisted with anger. "This isn't over. You owe me money, and I will get it one way or another." He left, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. Grace sank to the floor, sobbing. Noah ran to her. Lily stood frozen on the stairs, phone still in hand, trying to be brave, but clearly terrified. When Ethan came home that evening, Grace told him everything. About Hendricks, about the debts, about the threat of police in jail. "How much do you owe?" Ethan asked calmly, sitting down beside her. $3,000. I'll never be able to pay it back. Never." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then he said, "I'll pay it." "No, absolutely not. I won't let you." "It's already decided," he said firmly. "You're under my roof now. That makes you my responsibility." "I'm not your responsibility, but Then what are you?" Ethan asked, his voice rising with emotion he couldn't contain. "Because you're not a stranger anymore. You're not just passing through. You and Noah are part of this house now, part of our family. And families protect each other from people like Hendricks." Grace stared at him, completely overwhelmed. Why are you doing this? What do you want from me? What do you expect in return? Nothing, Ethan said simply, his voice returning to calm. I want nothing except to help you get back on your feet. That's all. No strings, no expectations, no debt between us. That night, unable to sleep, Grace made a decision. She would tell him the truth about the accident, about who she really was, about the connection between them. He deserved to know. Tomorrow she would tell him everything. The next morning, Lily developed a high fever. Ethan rushed her to the hospital, leaving Grace and Noah at home. Grace paced the house nervously, worried about the little girl who'd shown them such kindness and welcomed them without hesitation into her life. While cleaning Ethan's workshop to keep herself busy and useful, she found an old newspaper clipping tucked carefully in his toolbox. A photo of the accident, the headline reading, "Local man survives fiery crash thanks to mysterious rescuer." The article described everything: the truck losing control, the flames, the unknown woman who'd appeared and vanished like an angel. Grace sat down hard on the workshop floor, the newspaper shaking in her hands. There was no doubt anymore. No way to pretend, no way to hide. She was looking at the moment that had connected their lives forever. When Ethan returned from the hospital that evening, Lily safely medicated and sleeping in her room, he found Grace sitting at the kitchen table, the newspaper clipping placed between them. "We need to talk," she said quietly, her voice barely steady. Ethan looked at the clipping, then at her face, seeing the tears already forming. "What's this about?" 3 years ago, Grace began, her voice trembling. "I was working as an ER nurse at County General Hospital. I was driving home late from a double shift when I saw your accident happen right in front of me." Ethan went very still, his hand frozen halfway to the chair. "I pulled over immediately. Ran to your truck. You were unconscious, trapped behind the wheel. The fire was spreading from the engine. I knew the fuel tank would blow any second." "That was you?" Ethan whispered, barely able to form the words. Grace nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I pulled you out through the window because the door was crushed. Got you about 20 feet away when the truck exploded. The blast knocked us both down. I did CPR until you started breathing again. Then I called 911 and waited with you until help arrived." "But you disappeared," Ethan said, his voice full of confusion and wonder. "I asked everyone. The paramedics said a woman had saved my life, but no one knew who she was. They said you left before they could get your name." "I left," Grace said, her voice breaking, "because I'd abandoned my post at the hospital without authorization. My supervisor found out the next morning. Called it a severe violation of protocol. I tried to explain that I'd saved someone's life, but she said that didn't matter. Hospital policy was clear. Off-duty staff cannot provide emergency medical care without prior authorization because of liability concerns." Ethan's face showed shock, then growing anger. "They fired you for saving my life?" "Hospital policy," Grace said bitterly. "They said I could have made your injuries worse, could have been sued, could have exposed the hospital to legal action. So I was terminated immediately." "That's insane." "That's the rule." Grace wiped her eyes. "After that, everything fell apart. My husband couldn't handle the financial pressure. He left within 2 months. I couldn't get another nursing job with a termination on my record. I tried retail, waitressing, cleaning houses, anything. But it wasn't enough. We fell behind on rent, lost our apartment, then the boarding house, then nothing, and then you ended up walking down that mountain road in a snowstorm on Christmas Eve." Ethan finished quietly. "Yes." Grace pulled the burned fabric from her pocket with shaking hands. "A piece of your shirt. I tore it when I was pulling you free. I've carried it every single day for 3 years as a reminder that once I did something that mattered, that once I was someone who saved lives." Ethan stood slowly, went to his bedroom, and returned carrying a shirt from his closet. The same plaid pattern, one corner torn away. "I kept this shirt," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "even though it was covered in blood and smoke damage, because it reminded me that someone cared enough about a complete stranger to risk their life saving mine. They stared at each other across the table, the fabric and the shirt between them like puzzle pieces finally fitting together. "I'm so sorry," Grace said desperately. "I didn't know it was you when I came here. I swear I didn't know. And I should have told you sooner, but I was terrified you'd think I was manipulating you." "Stop," Ethan said firmly. He came around the table and pulled her into a fierce hug. "You saved my life," he said, his voice breaking. "You lost everything to save my life. And I've been trying to find you for 3 years." Grace sobbed into his shoulder. "I didn't want you to help me out of obligation." "This isn't obligation," Ethan said. "This is fate giving us both a second chance." Grace pulled away, wiping her face. "I need to leave. This is too complicated. You don't owe me anything." "You're not leaving," Ethan said firmly. "I destroyed my life to save yours. I lost everything. And I'm giving you a chance to rebuild everything," Ethan said. "If you'll let me." Grace shook her head, grabbed Noah's hand, and headed for the door. Ethan followed her outside into the falling snow. "You're really going to walk away?" he called. "Into another storm?" "I'll figure it out," Grace shouted back. "No, you've been drowning for 3 years. Admit it." "What do you want from me?" "I want you to stop running. I want you to let someone help you. I want you to stay." The words hung in the cold air between them. Before Grace could respond, headlights appeared. Mr. Hendricks with 2 police officers. "There she is," Y.A. Hendricks pointed. "Arrest her for theft and fraud." Ethan stepped between them and Grace. "She's not going anywhere." "She owes me $3,000. "Which I've already paid," Ethan said calmly, pulling a bank transfer receipt from his pocket. "2 hours ago. Check your account." Hendricks checked his phone, face turning red. You paid it?" "Every penny, plus late fees." The officers looked at each other. "If the debt is settled, there's no criminal case here." "She needs to be punished for being poor," one officer interrupted. "That's not a crime, sir." They got back in their car and left. Hendricks glared at Ethan. "She's a leech. She'll drain you dry." "Get off my property," Ethan said quietly. "Now." Hendricks left, muttering threats. Freeze moment. The snow fell softly. Noah clung to his mother. Lily watched from the porch. Grace looked at Ethan, at this man who'd paid her debts, protected her, sheltered her, all before knowing who she was. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do all this?" "Because 3 years ago," Ethan said gently, taking her hands, "you didn't ask if I deserved to be saved. You just saved me." He squeezed her hands. "Now it's my turn. Please, stop running. Stay." Grace nodded, unable to speak. Real witness detail. Ethan pulled a small wooden box from his pocket. Inside was a card he'd written years ago to his unknown rescuer. "I wrote this for you 3 years ago. I just didn't know it was for you." Grace opened it, reading through tears. "To the stranger who gave me life. I will spend my days trying to be worthy of your sacrifice." 1 month later, Ethan's small house had become a refuge for families in need. Grace helped him organize weekend meals for homeless families in the area. Noah called Ethan uncle and followed him everywhere with devoted admiration. The community noticed their work. Local churches donated food and supplies. Volunteers showed up to help cook and serve meals. The local paper ran a feature story. "Single dad opens home to those in need." But Ethan didn't do it for recognition or praise. He did it because he'd learned that being saved meant nothing if you didn't pass it forward to others who needed help. One evening, as they prepared dinner for a group of struggling families, Grace asked him, "Why do you really do all this? It would be so much easier to just donate money or volunteer somewhere else." Ethan thought for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "When you pulled me from that burning truck, you didn't know if I was a good person or a bad person. You didn't know if I had money or debts, friends or enemies, a family waiting or no one at all. You just knew I needed help, and you gave it without condition or judgment." "Yes," Grace said quietly. "That changed me fundamentally," Ethan continued. "Made me realize that worth isn't something you earn through achievement or status or success. It's something you already map just by being human. And if someone saw worth in me when I was literally on fire and unconscious, then I can see worth in anyone." no matter their circumstances or past mistakes. Grace's eyes filled with tears. I thought I'd lost everything that night 3 years ago. My toe, my marriage, my stability, my entire future. I thought saving you had completely ruined my life. And now, Ethan asked gently, now I think maybe it was all necessary somehow. Maybe I needed to be broken completely so I could be rebuilt into someone better, someone more compassionate and understanding. Symbol of rebirth. In the small kitchen, they hung a wooden sign carved with simple words. No one leaves here hungry. Not in this house. Families came and went over the following weeks. Some stayed for just one meal, some for several days or even weeks. Each one was treated with dignity, respect, and genuine care. One evening, as they cleaned up after serving dinner to a particularly large group, Noah asked Lily, Mom says we might be able to stay here forever now. Is that really true? Lily looked at her father, who was wiping down tables. He looked at Grace, who was putting away dishes. Would you want to? Ethan asked Grace quietly when the children had gone to play. Stay forever, I mean? Make this permanent? Grace's voice caught in her throat. If you and Lily would truly have us, then yes. This is the first place that's felt like a real home in so very long. The first place where I feel like I belong. Ethan smiled warmly. Then it's settled. You're not guests anymore, you're family. This is your home too. That night they celebrated by making a special dinner for everyone who'd helped them over the past month. Neighbors, church volunteers, even some of the families they'd housed temporarily. The small house overflowed with people, laughter, warmth, and genuine connection. Late that night, after everyone had left and the children were asleep, Ethan and Grace sat on the porch together, watching the stars appear in the clear winter sky. I've been thinking, Grace said, about going back to school, finishing my nursing degree properly this time, maybe even getting additional certifications. You should, Ethan encouraged. You're a natural healer. You should be doing that work. But it would take time, money. I'd need to work and study simultaneously. I'd be busy and stressed and we'll figure it out together, Ethan interrupted gently. That's what families do. They support each other through the hard things. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. Thank you for believing in me when I'd completely stopped believing in myself. Thank you for saving my life, Ethan replied softly. Both 3 years ago in that fire and every day since by reminding me what real courage looks like. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd been broken by life's cruelty and rebuilt by each other's kindness and compassion. 1 year later, everything had transformed. Ethan's house had officially become the Second Chance Home, a registered nonprofit organization providing temporary housing and job training for homeless families throughout the region. Grace had completed her nursing degree with honors and now worked part-time at the local clinic while helping run the shelter with passionate dedication. Lily and Noah were inseparable now, more like true siblings than just friends who happened to live together. On Christmas morning, exactly 1 year after Grace had knocked on doors with nowhere to go, they all gathered in the warm living room filled with light and laughter and love. Noah asked with the innocent seriousness only children possess, Mom, is this really our home now? Like forever and ever? Grace smiled through happy tears, pulling him close. Yes, baby, this is our home. Forever. Ethan added softly, ruffling Noah's hair. Because homes aren't just buildings made of wood and stone. They're the people who refuse to give up on you when life gets hard. Outside, gentle snow fell, covering the world in peaceful white silence. Lily and Noah ran to the porch together and carefully hung a new wooden sign they'd made in secret as a Christmas gift. We had nowhere to go until someone said, "You do now." The sign would hang there for years to come, reminding everyone who passed that miracles don't always look miraculous or dramatic or extraordinary. Sometimes they look like a man stopping his truck in a snowstorm. Sometimes they look like a woman pulling a stranger from burning metal. Sometimes they look like two broken people choosing to rebuild each other with patience and grace, one difficult day at a time. Grace looked around at the life they'd built together, the shelter helping dozens of families, the children laughing freely, the warmth filling every corner of their home. She'd thought she'd lost everything that night she saved Ethan's life. But perhaps she hadn't lost anything at all. Perhaps she'd just been redirected to exactly where she needed to be. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to Strong Dad Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.